The first laugh cut sharper than a knife, and May Ellison pretended not to hear it. She kept her eyes on the dirt road running through Willow Creek, on the line of black coats and simple dresses on the wooden platform, where a bugler lifted a dented horn to his lips. The town had gathered to honor their dead boys, who went out chasing wages on a winter cattle drive and never came back. Their names carved into a plank that leaned crooked against the courthouse wall. The bugle sang a long, lonely note. People bowed their heads, and May, in a faded blue dress with seams that tugged at her shoulders, stepped forward with a wreath of wild sage and late asters. She had tied herself in the boarding house kitchen before dawn. She wanted to lay it at the base of the plank, say a prayer under her breath, and slip away before anyone remembered who she was. Someone remembered anyway. It happens fast in small places. A whisper becomes a grin, becomes a voice that rises just enough to catch the wind. That one, someone said. Look at her all dressed up like a Sunday cake. She thinks the dead are watching. Another voice, softer and meaner, followed, as if it could slide under her skin unnoticed. If she wanted a man to look twice, she should have thought about that years ago. May felt the words like pebbles flung at a window pane. Nothing shattered, but everything trembled. She shifted the wreath to her other hand and kept walking one step another. The boardwalk creaking beneath her weight, the sun bright enough to make her squint. She had promised herself she would not look down. Not at her shoes cracked at the toes, not at her dress let out twice and stitched back by tired fingers. Not at her hands, thick and competent and forever compared to the hands of smaller women. Her brother's name was the second from the top, carved with a pocket-knife letters uneven. Levi Ellison. She traced the L with a gloved finger, set the wreath below the plank, and whispered what she had come to whisper. Then she turned ready to walk away. That was when she saw him. He was leaned against the hitching rail beneath the telegraph window, quiet the way a mountain can be quiet. Tall, with a worn hat brim casting his eyes in shade, and a coat buttoned to the throat because the wind off the river had teeth today. A man you would not notice until you had to, and once you saw him, you could not easily pretend you hadn't. Jonah Creed, someone would have told you if you asked. One season widowed, ran 3,000 acres north of the Cottonwoods. A daughter who did not speak to strangers unless she felt like it, and a reputation for trading fair, even when nobody was watching. May had no plans to know anything about Jonah Creed. She had plans to make it back to the boarding house scrub pots for Mrs. Flynn, darn 2 shirts for a miner who always paid late, and keep her head down the way a woman does when the world has already made up its mind about her. But as she stepped from the platform, a boy in a patched coat jostled her, not on purpose, just the clumsy physics of a crowd. Her wreath slipped, tipped, knocked her balance off center. She stumbled. The laughter she had heard before swelled, little gusts of it enough to sting. May caught herself barely and straightened as quick as she could. And then a hand extended into her field of sight, palm open, steady. She didn't take it. Pride is a horse that throws you often, and still you climb back on. I'm fine, she said, though her voice was too bright to be true. The man did not insist. He lowered his hand as if it were not a refusal at all. Nobody should have to do that alone, he said, nodding toward the names on the plank. The words were simple, flat as a good board, but they landed somewhere that hadn't been touched all morning. For a second, May forgot the town, the seams, the laughter. She didn't know why this stranger's sentence felt like the first warm thing she had heard in a year, only that it did. Thank you, she said, and surprised herself because it came out sounding like she meant it. The crowd began to unravel. Someone told a joke too loud near the mercantile doors. A baby cried. 2 men argued about the price of salt pork as if grief did not have the right to raise its voice over commerce. May edged toward the alley between the barber and the telegraph office to avoid passing the knot of women gathered at the pump handle. The same faces who had watched her spill flour on the boarding house steps last week and made it a story big enough to pass from porch to porch. Her world was a narrow corridor, and today it seemed narrower. She almost made it into the alley when a girl in a red scarf darted straight toward her, small, bright, fast as a wren. The girl skidded to a stop, inches from May's skirt, and looked up with blue eyes that did not ask permission to be honest. You're pretty, the girl said, as if she were announcing the weather. May's mind went blank. Grown people had tried to soften that word for her whole life the way you soften a hard biscuit with gravy, and only make the plate heavy. Pretty enough in the right light. Pretty if she lost a little. Pretty hands at least. Nobody had said it like the air, like a fact. The girl reached out and pinched a bit of May's sleeve between two fingers, considering the fabric like it might tell her a story. Then she grinned, gap-toothed. "I'm Wren," she said. "My daddy's Jonah." "Come on, Daddy. Tell her. We have to tell her." Jonah Creed had stepped away from the rail without May noticing. He stood now a few feet off hat brim, tilted back just a little, so she could see his eyes gray, the way the river was gray when clouds gathered. "I won't keep you," he said, "but I heard your brother's name, and I watched you stand when other folks didn't. I'm not asking you for anything you don't want to give. I'm offering work if you're looking for it." May blinked. She was not sure she had ever been offered anything without a catch tied to it. What kind of work, she asked, and braced herself to be embarrassed. Jonah's answer was plain. "My place runs on the edge of the cottonwoods. There's more to do than a man and a child can do well. I need help that's steady, someone who won't spook when the wind talks, someone who can keep a pot from burning and a child from wandering and tell the truth when it's hard." May's cheeks burned. "I'm no cook to brag about," she said. "I overboil coffee and scorch onions to spite myself." She almost added, "And people laugh at me for breathing," but the words lodged somewhere and would not pass. Wren's hand slid into hers like it belonged there. "I don't like coffee," Wren announced, "and burned onions taste like camp, and I like camp." May did not laugh, but something in her chest loosened enough she could draw a full breath. "Why me?" she said, and hated how small it sounded. Jonah looked at the wreath against the plank and then back to her. "Because you carried what you came to carry even with people watching. Because I've watched folks who talk fine fold under less. Because Wren looked at you and said a word I have not heard her say in months." The last sentence hung between them, quiet and heavier than the rest. May looked at the girl, at her red scarf gone crooked from running at a smear of river dust on her cheek. The world did a small, startling thing inside her, then the way a room does when someone opens a shutter you did not know was there, and light finds a wall that has always been bare. "They will say, it's foolish," May said. Jonah tipped his head a fraction as if he had been waiting for that line and had an answer ready. "They say lots of things." Wren squeezed May's fingers. "You can sit on the wagon seat and tell me stories," she offered. "I like stories about rivers. I like stories about people who don't go missing. There is a kind of fear that keeps you from stepping, and a kind that tells you where the ground is solid." May had learned to tell one from the other by failing and surviving. She felt both now, braided. She could see the boarding house, the sink full of gray water, the men who said thank you without looking. The nights she pressed her palm to her own ribs to quiet the ache. She could also see cottonwoods and wind and a porch she had not stood on, and a girl with a red scarf pronouncing weather like blessing. "If I do poorly," she said, "you say it plain, and I go without making trouble." Jonah nodded. "Plain suits me." For the first time since the bugle, May smiled. It was not wide. It was a line starting to curve shy of itself, but it was real. "All right then," she said. "I'll come for a trial if Mrs. Flynn lets me loose by week's end." Jonah's reply came simple. "We'll make room." Wren did not cheer. She did not clap. She only held May's hand a heartbeat longer, then ran 2 quick circles around the hitching post like a bird testing air. The wind off the river shifted. It smelled like damp earth and horses in the faint bitter of coal smoke at the edge of town. Somewhere a bell rang. May glanced once at the plank of names and lowered her head a fraction, not in shame but in a promise she did not speak aloud. Then she lifted her chin and stepped down off the boardwalk toward the road that led north, and the laughter behind her, for the first time in a very long time, did not follow her farther than her own shadow. The road out of Willow Creek wound north between low ridges, rutted deep from wagon wheels and frozen hard, where the river mist had settled overnight. May sat stiff on the wagon seat, hands clasped too tight in her lap, while Jonah held the reins with the same quiet patience he seemed to use for everything. Wren perched between them, scarf flapping, humming a tune that had no words. The girl leaned against May, as if she had always belonged there. May tried not to notice how natural it felt, how dangerous. Belonging, she reminded herself, was a word that could vanish when people laughed loud enough. They passed the cottonwoods at dusk, tall trunks black against the pale sky. The ranch spread beyond them, fences stretching like ribs across the land. Barns hunched low against the wind. Smoke drifted from a chimney, steady blue-gray. The cabin was plain but well kept, the porch swept clean. Jonah guided the team to a halt. Wren scrambled down before the wagon stopped rolling and dashed toward the door. May hesitated, staring at the threshold. She had stepped through many doors in her life, most of them belonging to other people's kitchens, other people's needs. Each time she entered, she braced herself for the inevitable moment when she would be told she did not fit. Jonah climbed down, turned back, and held out his hand. He didn't say, "Come on." He didn't need to. The invitation was in the stillness of his posture, the patience of a man who would wait all night if he had to. The cabin smelled of cedar and stew. The table was scarred, the chairs mismatched, but the fire in the hearth threw warmth across the room in a way May could not remember feeling in years. She set her satchel near the door, suddenly unsure where to stand. Wren tugged her sleeve, dragging her toward a shelf where drawings cluttered the space between chipped mugs. Crooked horses, shaky letters, flowers that looked like suns. Wren shoved a scrap of paper into her hand. "That's you," she said proudly. May blinked down at a crooked oval face with hair sticking out like hay. She wanted to laugh, to cry, to hide it all at once. Instead, she folded the paper carefully and slid it into her satchel, as if it were worth more than any coin. Jonah showed her the spare room, smaller than the boarding house kitchen, but with a bedstead carved by a careful hand. A quilt lay folded at the foot, pieced together from faded shirts and trousers. May touched the fabric with cautious fingers. "I don't deserve this," she thought, though she did not speak it aloud. Later at supper, she spilled broth, trying to ladle her portion. She apologized too quickly. Cheeks hot. Jonah said nothing, only passed her another slice of bread, as if mistakes were not worth noticing. Wren chattered about a stray cat that had prowled near the barn. May listened, nodding, letting the rhythm of the girl's voice soften the edges of her own nerves. Night deepened. Outside, the wind picked at the shutters. May lay awake long after the others slept, staring at the rafters. She thought about the women in town, their laughter like needles. She thought about her brother Levi, buried under frozen ground far from home. She thought about Jonah's hand, steady on the reins, the way he hadn't looked at her like a problem to be solved. Fear pressed at her chest, fear of failing, of being sent away, of caring too much too soon. And yet beneath the fear, something stirred, a small ember of wanting she had almost forgotten how to feed. Wanting to stay, to be useful, to matter. Wanting to believe that Wren's word "pretty" might someday sound true even in her own ears. The next morning, the ranch tested her. The pump handle stuck, the fire smoked, the bread burned. May cursed under her breath, a habit she thought she'd lost. When she dropped a tin plate, it clattered loud enough to startle the chickens outside. She froze, waiting for Jonah's rebuke, for the sigh that said she had already worn out her welcome. Instead, he appeared in the doorway with a bucket of warm water, set it on the counter, and said, "Only for washing." Then he turned back out, as if it were the most natural thing in the world to meet failure with help instead of scorn. May stood motionless for a long time, steam curling into her face before her eyes burned hot with something dangerously close to gratitude. That evening, as the fire crackled and Wren bent over her drawings, May found herself laughing at one of the child's crooked horses. The sound startled her, light and unguarded. Jonah looked up from mending tack, not smiling. Not speaking, but his eyes lingered on her, a heartbeat too long. May caught it, felt the weight of it, and looked quickly away. But later, when she entered her small room, she found a folded towel on the bed, warm from the stove, and a single peppermint candy resting on top. No note, no explanation, just quiet kindness left in the dark. May sat on the edge of the bed, candy in her palm, and for the first time in years whispered aloud to the silence, "Maybe I could belong." The days that followed stitched themselves into a rhythm May had never known. Dawn came early, spilling pale light through the east window, and she rose with it, her hands raw from scrubbing her back, sore from lifting, but her spirit held by the sound of Wren's laughter darting through the cabin. Jonah worked the pastures most mornings, returning with dust in his coat and silence on his tongue. But it was a silence that no longer frightened May. It was steady like the ground under her boots, a silence that made space for her to breathe. Still, doubt lingered. Each mistake she made, each dropped dish or crooked seam threatened to undo her. When she burned the stew for the second time in a week, she nearly fled out the door ready to pack her satchel before anyone could tell her she was unwelcome. But then Wren's small hand found hers tugging gently. "It tastes like camp," the girl said again, grinning with the reckless honesty only children can give. May laughed through the ache in her chest. Jonah said nothing, only set a fresh log on the fire, and somehow that was louder than any reassurance could have been. One sharp morning, the kind when frost still clung to the grass. Though the sun had climbed, Wren wandered past the fence. May turned just in time to see her small figure running toward the paddock, where 3 unbroken horses stamped and tossed their manes. Terror bolted through May like lightning. She shouted, but the wind tore the sound away. Without thought, without fear for herself, she sprinted, skirts flying, lungs burning. The silver-gray stallion reared hooves, slamming the earth. May threw herself forward, wrapping Wren in her arms, turning her body to shield the child just as the horse lunged. The ground shook. Her heart stuttered. Then arms stronger than iron seized them both, pulling them through the gate in a storm of dust. "Jonah." His chest heaved, eyes wide, face pale beneath the brim of his hat. Wren sobbed against May's shoulder, clutching her as if she would never let go. May gasped, shaking from head to toe, every nerve screaming. Jonah crouched beside them, one hand trembling over his daughter's curls, the other steady on May's shoulder. "You didn't even hesitate," he said, voice rough. May's throat tightened. "She was out there alone," she whispered. "I couldn't let her." Jonah cut her off gently. "You could have been killed." May shook her head. "I didn't care." The silence that followed was thicker than smoke. Jonah's gaze lingered not on her mistakes, not on her figure, not on the weight she carried from a town's cruel laughter, but on the way she held his daughter as if the child were sacred. His words, when they came, were quiet enough to tremble. "You're more important than you think, May." She blinked, stunned, sure she had misheard. But he didn't repeat it. He only stood, gathered Wren into his arms, and led them both back toward the cabin. That night, May found a small gift on her bed. A comb hand-carved from wood, polished smooth with a heart etched delicately into the handle. No note, no explanation, only the weight of gratitude unspoken. May held it in her palm, running her thumb over the grooves again and again until her eyes burned with tears she refused to shed. No one had ever given her anything without demanding something back. No one had ever said not with words, but with action that she was seen. She lay awake long past midnight, the comb resting on her chest, and whispered into the darkness, "He's not like the others." But the world beyond Hollow Ridge did not forget her. Rumors stirred again, carried on careless tongues through the general store and across the church steps. A name muttered, a scandal revived, half-truths sharpened into lies. May heard them like burrs caught in fabric, scratching, catching, refusing to fall away. One afternoon, as she carried apples in her arms, she turned and found herself face to face with Samuel Price, a man from Red Valley whose smile had once promised safety but delivered ruin instead. Tall, polished eyes cold as glass. "Well, if it isn't the belle of the scandal," he drawled. Her stomach turned to stone. Samuel stepped closer, his voice oily. "You always did have a way of disappearing. I came with an offer. Letters, a few kind words in the right places. I could clean your name. You could walk into a church again without people laughing." May's grip on the apple basket trembled. "And in exchange," she asked flatly. His smile widened. "In exchange for finishing what you started." The slap landed before she knew her hand had moved. He staggered, stunned. "You ruined me," she spat, breath shaking. "And now you think I'd let you own me again?" His expression twisted. "I gave you the chance to matter." And then another voice cut through, low and firm. "She already does." May turned, heart pounding. Jonah stood just beyond the fence, arms crossed, jaw clenched, eyes hard as stone. He stepped forward, every stride like thunder. "This is between us," Samuel snapped. Jonah shook his head slowly. "You made it about the town when you branded her with lies. You made it mine when you came here thinking she was still defenseless." The air crackled. May's breath caught. Jonah's voice dropped, calm but lethal. "I know her. She rises before dawn. She works until her hands blister. She throws herself in front of a horse for my daughter. She doesn't need your permission to be whole." Samuel faltered, rage flickering. Jonah stepped closer, toe to toe. You don't define her worth. She does. Silence stretched until even the wind seemed to hold still. Samuel scoffed, adjusted his collar, and turned away, muttering threats that scattered uselessly behind him. Jonah watched until he vanished, then turned to May. You all right? She nodded, eyes glassy, chest heaving. Jonah's words still echoed louder than the rumors ever had. You never have to answer for who you were, only who you are. The truth of it lodged deep steady as a nail-driven home. May stood there, breath shallow, and for the first time in years believed she might be more than what the world had named her. The weeks after Samuel's visit left May restless. She carried his threat in the back of her mind like a burr. She could not shake, scratching at her, even in quiet moments. When she scrubbed the floors, she heard his voice. When she stirred a pot of beans, she remembered his smile. Yet louder than all of it was Jonah's defense. The way his words had rolled out with calm certainty, as if he were not protecting a fragile woman, but stating a truth carved in stone. You don't define her worth. She does. Those words echoed long after Samuel vanished into the dust. But May's heart was a traitor. It told her not to trust what she'd heard at the fence. One cold evening, while she dried tin cups in the kitchen, voices carried through the window clear in the still night. Reverend Ellison stood on the porch, his tone earnest. Your daughter needs stability, Jonah. A home should have a mother as well as a father. You've grieved long enough. May froze, rag clenched in her fist. Then Jonah's voice steady, but the words fell sharp as ice. I don't need another wife. She felt the air punch out of her lungs. Not another wife. Just help. Just a placeholder. The rag slipped from her fingers into the basin. She didn't wait to hear more. She walked to her room, closed the door without sound, and stared at the wooden comb on her nightstand. The heart carved into its handle mocked her now. She reached for her satchel, folding her shawl with trembling hands, tucking away only what she needed. Not everything, just enough to vanish without making noise. Children forget, she told herself. Wren will forget me. She repeated it until the words were ash in her throat. By midnight, the storm had gathered. Snow fell in thick sheets, wine clawing at the shutters. May slipped out into the night, boots crunching on the frozen ground. Each step tore something loose inside her, but she pressed on. She did not hear the soft creak of Wren's door opening, the whisper of small feet across the floorboards. Wren woke to the wrongness of silence. May's bed was made. The comb was gone. No, the child whispered, fists tight. No, she wouldn't leave me. She grabbed her little coat from its peg and ran into the storm, calling May's name. Her voice vanished into the howl of wind, but she didn't stop. Past the barn, past the fences, into the fields, where the snow lay deep enough to swallow her boots. The night devoured her cries. When Jonah found her room empty, panic cracked through him like a whip. Lantern in hand, he shouted, his voice raw. Hannah Wren neighbors roused, torches flaring in the storm, dogs barking at shadows. Men spread across the ridge, boots sinking in drifts, hearts pounding with the urgency of loss. Jonah's lungs burned as he ran, snow clawing at his legs, but he would not stop. Not tonight. Not when both of them, his daughter and the woman he had come to rely on, more than breath, were out in the storm's teeth. Out in the darkness, May stumbled forward, lantern swinging wildly. Her voice cracked against the wind. Sweetheart, where are you? Panic hollowed her chest. Then through the blur of snow, she saw a small shape curled beneath a lone pine, still too still. Her heart stopped. She dropped the lantern, falling to her knees. Wren. She gathered the girl into her arms, wrapping her shawl around them both. The child stirred faintly, eyes fluttering open, whispering through chattering teeth. I thought you left forever. May's throat tore with a sob. I thought I should, she confessed. Wren shook her head weakly. Don't. You make my daddy smile again. The words struck like lightning, sharp and undeniable. Before May could answer, footsteps thundered behind her. Jonah burst through the snow lantern, light spilling across the clearing. He dropped to his knees, arms wrapping around them, both pulling them into a hold, fierce and trembling. Thank God, he whispered again and again, forehead pressed to May's shoulder. Thank God. Wren clung to them both. Her small sobs muffled in the storm, and Jonah held them as if the world itself could not pry them apart. In that circle of arms with snow falling heavy and silence roaring in her ears, May realized she had been wrong. She was not just help. She was not just a shadow. She was wanted. She was needed. And for the first time in years, she believed it. The storm broke by morning, leaving the ridge silver and silent. The world hushed beneath a thick quilt of snow. Jonah had carried Wren into the cabin, laid her by the hearth and wrapped her in quilts until the color returned to her cheeks. May sat beside the child, brushing damp curls from her forehead, her own body trembling with exhaustion. Jonah stood in the doorway, shoulders bowed as if the weight of the night had finally settled on him. When Wren's breathing softened into sleep, he crossed the room and lowered himself onto the bench across from May. His eyes were raw, stripped of the calm distance she had always seen. "I never meant what you thought you heard," he said quietly. May blinked, heart thudding. He swallowed, voice steady but thick. "I didn't say I didn't want you. I said I didn't need another wife because I already found someone who made this house a home. Someone who brought my daughter back to life. Someone who made me remember I could feel again." The words hit harder than any storm. May's breath caught tears brimming. She searched his face for hesitation, for pity, for anything false, but found only truth, stark and unguarded. Jonah reached into his coat, pulled out a small silver ring, worn but clean, and held it in his calloused hand. "Will you marry me not because of need, because I choose you?" The silence was broken only by the crackle of fire. May stared at the ring, her throat too tight for words. Then a whisper rose from the quilts beside her. "Say yes." Wren's sleepy voice, small but certain, cut through every doubt. May laughed through her tears, a sound trembling, and knew and nodded. Yes. The wedding came weeks later, held beneath a cottonwood tree at the edge of Hollow Ridge. The snow had melted into soft earth, and the branches swayed overhead like quiet witnesses. Townsfolk gathered not with the sharp eyes of gossip, but with warmth, as if they too had been changed by the storm. Wooden benches lined the slope, mason jars filled with wildflowers sat at the ends, and children darted between the rows with laughter bright as bells. May wore a new dress, plain cream stitched by her own hands. She felt no shame in its simplicity, no weight in its seams. She carried Wren's hand in one palm and Jonah's in the other, the triangle of them steady against the whispers of the wind. When Jonah spoke his vows, his voice did not waver. "I do," he said, and May knew the words were forged not in impulse, but in fire and time. After the ceremony, the town did not scatter. They stayed. They passed pie and cider, sang hymns half forgotten, and for the first time since grief had buried itself in Jonah's chest, Hollow Ridge rang with laughter that did not wound. May stood at the center of it, her cheeks flushed, her heart unburdened, and thought, "I have not just survived. I have begun." Spring stretched itself across the valley, soft and green, carrying with it a kind of peace May had never known. Mornings were filled with birdsong instead of whispers, evenings with the quiet hum of chores shared rather than endured. She woke each day beside a man who had learned how to smile again, and a child who now ran freely, scarf trailing like a banner, her laughter carrying farther than the fences. Yet even in the comfort of her new life, May felt the echo of the woman she once was, the one who believed her worth could be measured by the scorn of a town. Jonah noticed before she ever spoke it aloud. One morning she stepped outside and found him by the barn hammer, in hand cedar beams rising into a half-built frame. "What's this?" she asked, brow furrowed. Jonah wiped sweat from his brow and straightened. "I'm building you a room," he said simply, "facing east so the sun will always find it first." May stared, words stolen. Why? Her voice cracked. He leaned the hammer against the wood, eyes soft but unwavering. "Because you turned this place into more than fences and hay. You made it a home again. A home deserves to give something back." When it was finished, the room glowed in the morning light. Shelves lined with books Jonah had bartered for a desk beneath the window, a space that belonged to her alone. May ran her fingers along the wood. The grain warm, the smell of cedar still fresh. The woman who had once carried shame like a shroud now stood in a room built from love, and for the first time she allowed herself to believe she deserved it. News of the room spread. Neighbors came, curious at first, then stayed, sending their children with questions scrawled on scraps of paper. By summer, 5 students crowded the porch each morning, their faces flushed with eagerness. May taught them letters, number stories she had carried silently for years. Wren sat beside her, tracing words with careful fingers, proud of every crooked line. Sometimes Jonah leaned in the doorway, arms crossed, watching the scene as if it were something sacred. But peace is never free from challenge. Whispers from town found their way to her, still mutters about the woman who once brought shame to Red Valley, who had dared to marry a rancher with land and a name. Yet the words no longer cut as they once had. Each time May returned home to laughter on the porch, to Jonah's steady hand brushing against hers, to Wren tugging at her sleeve with a new drawing. The world could whisper what it wished. Hollow Ridge spoke louder. One evening after the last child had gone, May sat alone in her room as the sun dipped low, painting the walls gold. On her desk lay the wooden comb Jonah had carved, worn smooth by her touch. She picked it up, thumb tracing the heart etched in its handle, and remembered the night she thought her story ended in snow and shame. She whispered into the quiet, "I thought I had to be beautiful to be loved, but being loved made me beautiful." The words lingered gentle as the dusk, and for the first time she did not flinch from them. Outside, fireflies rose in the tall grass. Wren chased them with shrieks of delight, Jonah's voice calling after her, warm with laughter. May stepped to the doorway, comb still in her hand, and breathed deep the scent of earth and cedar of a life remade. The past had not vanished, but it no longer defined her. She was May Ellison, teacher wife, mother of a girl who called her pretty. And in the hush between heartbeats she knew the truth. Love had not rescued her, it had revealed her. Summer ripened into autumn, and Hollow Ridge thrummed with the kind of life May once believed was reserved for other people. The porch rang with the scuff of children's boots, their laughter chasing each other through lessons and games. Jonah's herd grew strong in the high pastures, his shoulders less burdened. His silences now filled with quiet content instead of grief. Wren taller by an inch and louder by a mile, braided flowers into May's hair as if it were the most natural thing in the world to belong to one another. Yet May never forgot the woman she had been. When she walked into town now, heads still turned. Some nodded, others whispered, but the sting no longer pierced as it once did. Because at her side walked Jonah, steady as a mountain, and Wren, who clutched her hand without shame. No rumor could undo what had been built on nights of firelight, on storms endured together, on the soft weight of a wooden comb resting on a nightstand. One afternoon, the church bell tolled for a wedding, another couple binding themselves with promises. May watched from the back pew, her hand resting in Jonah's. Wren nestled between them. When the bride stepped down the aisle in lace and lilies, May did not ache for what she lacked. Instead, she remembered the cottonwood tree, the mason jars filled with wildflowers. Jonah's vow spoken plain, in the way the town had stayed after, to laugh and share cider. Hers had not been a grand wedding, but it had been honest. Honest was stronger than grand. As the seasons turned again, May's classroom grew. More children arrived, boots, muddy faces, eager their parents lingering on the porch to share a word with Jonah, or to watch May's steady patience at the blackboard. A woman once mocked for daring to wear a dress of memory had become the keeper of futures, teaching children to carve letters into paper instead of cruelty into each other's hearts. One evening after the last child had gone, Jonah found her by the eastern window of her room, the sky ablaze with the colors of sunset. She held the comb still, though its grooves had worn smooth with years of touch. "Do you ever think of before?" she asked softly. Jonah set his hands on her shoulders, solid and sure. "I think of it only to measure the distance." May smiled, tears pricking her eyes because she understood. The distance between shame and home was longer than a lifetime, and yet she had walked it. As night fell, Wren darted into the room, hair wild, cheeks flushed. She held up a new drawing, three figures beneath a great cottonwood hands, joined, smiles wide. She thrust it into May's hands and grinned. "See, it's us." May looked at the crooked lines that somehow held the truth of everything, and felt her heart swell until it ached. Later, as the fire crackled and the world outside hushed, May whispered into the quiet, "I once thought love had to find me in the form of beauty, but here in this home I learned beauty was what love saw in me when I couldn't." Jonah pressed a kiss to her hair. Wren snored softly in the next room, and Hollow Ridge breathed around them. And so the woman who had once been scorned became the heart of a family, the teacher of a town, and the proof that dignity can be restored not by changing who you are, but by being seen as you always were. Her story ended not in whispers of laughter, but in the steady hum of belonging, a song louder than any jeer sung beneath the wide sky of the frontier, where second chances are carved into cedar and carried on the wind.